I told Henry Reed I didn't have time to travel to Long Island, especially on a weeknight. And even if I did, because he offered chauffeurs, helicopters, police escorts, I told him I couldn't speak specifically about our protocol trials because the research, though promising, was incomplete. And yes, I was the most knowledgeable on the broader subject of antiretrovirals, but there were better speakers for a non-scientific audience. I gave him a list of colleagues who were the public faces of AIDS research, and that was that. Except it wasn't. A few days later, my review board called me in and suggested in the strongest possible terms that I accede to Henry's request to speak at an AIDS fundraiser at his home in Amagansett. It made no sense. Never mind that I, who brought in the single largest NIH grant in the history of AIDS research, felt it was too soon. A rich man had spoken, and to Long Island I went. The larger conundrum in all of this, I had plenty of time to ponder it because I insisted on taking the LIRR instead of riding in one of the Reeds' fancy cars, was Henry's motive. I didn't believe he was simply a dedicated AIDS activist. That wasn't complicated enough for a man of his self-importance. A more obvious motive for Henry's interest in my work was money. He wanted advance word on our research so he could invest in the company that would bring our drug to market. But that didn't really explain his persistence. I mean, really, what's another gazillion to a gazillionaire? I admit my suspicions about Henry's motives weren't altogether rational. I had met him immediately before one of my 4 trial patients died. The death unmoored me. The patient's viral load had plummeted. He was up and about. If our experimental drug killed the patient, the trial was over, and so is the best hope yet for millions of AIDS patients. Everything depended on the cause of death. Eventually, the autopsy cleared our lab. The patient died of anaphylactic shock after eating shellfish. The irony that the patient felt well enough to go out for dinner, probably because of our treatment, wasn't lost on us. But the fact remained that the death had nothing to do with our protocol. Our work would continue once we found a compatible trial candidate. Repositioning myself again in the train's oddly rigid seat, and still annoyed I had had to leave the lab for the day, I remembered someone had told me in passing Henry had political aspirations. That might explain his bullheadedness about my speaking to his foundation. Sensitivity to the AIDS crisis could be a strong plank to run on in an urban district, and a public relationship with a hotshot researcher wouldn't hurt. Politics. That was duplicitous enough for Henry. The talk went well, and afterward I took questions from the audience for another 30 minutes. Meantime, Nuala Day, the Reeds' housekeeper, assisted by a fleet of cowed waiters, set up a supper buffet in the Reeds' dining room. "There's one more person I want you to meet," Henry said, steering me away from the crowd. I was tired, had a long ride back to the city. The food smelled good, rich, and hot. But for the first time since I'd met the man, I heard a note of supplication in his voice. So I allowed him to guide me down a hallway that led to a separate part of the house. We climbed a back staircase, and on each landing, the sounds of a fundraiser faded. On the 3rd floor, all I could hear was the advance and retreat of the sea. There, the stairs ended, opening onto an octagonal room with large windows and deep window seats set into each wall. During the day, the view must have been spectacular. There was a high-powered telescope trained on the night sky. It was like the top of a lighthouse or a spectacular tree fort, a room an imaginative child would insist on as his own. Floor-to-ceiling curtains formed an enclosure in the center of the room. Light flickered within, and the laugh track from a television show leaked through. Suddenly someone called out, "Who's there?" "It's Henry." The sound from the television was muted, but the light continued to flicker. From inside the partition space came an exaggerated exhalation, and then, "It's about time." The voice was cross, ancient, imperious, weak. "Gabrielle," Henry said, "I've brought someone to meet you. A new friend." "A new friend?" The voice perfectly matched Henry's false, bright tone. "Why do you need a new friend?" "Not for me," Henry said, "for you. Open the drapes, please, Gabrielle." I never knew the word please was part of Henry's vocabulary. "Will you promise to stay more than 17 seconds this time?" "I promise. Please open the drapes." "You do it, Henry." A remote control slipped between two curtain panels and fell to the wide planked floor. Henry retrieved it and pushed a button. The curtains drew back to reveal a boy reclining against an array of pillows on a large box bed. Grievously thin, maybe 18, maybe 20 years old. Multiple IV lines ran to his body. Cutaneous lesions scored his arms and torso, some healed over, others blistering. From his labored breathing, I suspected they were also in his lungs. He was having trouble keeping his eyes open, but his enormous head, teetering on the dandelion stalk of his neck, swiveled toward Henry, back to me, and then collapsed against the pillow from the exertion. Henry smoothed the boy's forehead, combed his fingers through his sweaty hair. "Henry," I said, "is this your son?" Henry shook his head. "Our housekeeper, Nuala Days. They've been with us since Gabriel was a little boy." I checked Gabriel's IVs and bedside medications, vinblastine, imiquimod, saline, and glucose, palliatives, homeopathic pipe dreams, and a black market drug I recognized, a CCR5 receptor antagonist that had good results in mice, but it would be almost a year before the FDA allowed humans into trials. As I took Gabriel's rabbity pulse, I watched Henry's face. How often had I seen that expression? Feverish hope extinguishing any practical understanding of disease. It demanded, "You're a doctor, fix him." Gabriel had fallen asleep. I told Henry I would call his doctor first thing in the morning. "That is Preston Bird. He's just downstairs if you want to talk to him, but what I want is..." "What, Henry?" "I want Gabriel to be your new trial patient." Henry cleared his throat. "I'd heard you had a recent vacancy." "Thank you."